Now comes the fun part, brushing. After all the prepping, sanding, and base coating, it's finally time to start adding some color to the Witchling Frog. I'm starting off with purple as my first shade, using it to lay down the base tones and give the piece that magical, witchy vibe. I dip the brush lightly into the paint and start with a few soft strokes, building up the color slowly instead of going heavy all at once. This helps me control how much paint goes on and keeps the texture smooth. I focus on the main areas of the hat and clothing first, blending the purple in layers to create some nice variation in tone. As I paint, I make sure to move the brush in the same direction as the model's surface details. It helps the strokes flow naturally and keeps the finish clean. You'll notice I go back and forth between light and dark areas, building a bit of depth and shadow as I go. Even with just a few strokes, the model starts to come to life. The purple gives it that perfect mystical touch, setting the tone for the rest of the colors I'll be adding later. This part is one of my favorites because you finally get to see the personality of the Witchling Frog start to shine through. I'll keep layering and blending as I go, taking my time to make sure everything feels balanced and smooth. It's a relaxing process, just me, a brush, and a bit of color to bring this little frog to life. Stay tuned for the next part where I'll start adding more shades and highlights to really make the details pop. Now I'm switching over to yellow to paint the buckle on the hat. This small detail really helps break up the darker colors and adds a nice pop of contrast to the piece. I'm using a fine brush for this part to stay within the lines and keep the edges clean. Yellow can be a little tricky since it's a lighter color, so I apply it in thin layers, letting each one dry a bit before adding the next. This helps the color build up evenly without getting streaky. Even though it's a small area, the yellow buckle instantly draws attention and gives the witchy hat that extra bit of charm. Little touches like this really make the whole piece come together and add character to the witchling frog. I'm really liking how the Witchling Frog is coming together so far. The colors are starting to blend nicely, and you can finally see the personality of the piece starting to shine through. Now it's time to move on to the next detail, painting the broom. For the broom, I'm using a warm brown color as the base. It gives that natural, wooden look and adds a nice contrast against the cooler tones of the frog and hat. I start by brushing on a thin, even coat, making sure to follow the direction of the sculpted lines so it mimics the texture of real wood. I go back in with a slightly darker brown to add some depth and shading along the grooves and edges. This helps make the broom look a bit more realistic and gives it that aged, worn feel, like it's been used for a few magical flights. At this point, the whole piece is starting to look more cohesive. All the little parts are coming together nicely. I'm happy with how it's turning out so far, and the broom definitely adds to the overall witchy vibe of the frog. Now it's time to work on the broomstick, one of my favorite little details of this Witchling Frog project. The broomstick really adds that magical, witchy touch and ties the whole piece together, so I wanted to give it a nice finish that looks both rustic and handmade. Start by applying a base coat in a warm brown tone to give it that natural wood look. I use a small brush to get an even layer across the handle, making sure to get into all the little grooves and textures. Once the base coat is dry, I come back with a slightly darker brown mixed with a hint of black to add depth and shadow. This step helps bring out the grain and makes the broomstick look more realistic, like it's been used for a while. I start by applying a base layer of green with a small brush, making sure to cover all the areas evenly. Since the model has a lot of curves and small details, like the hat, eyes, and tiny limbs, I take my time, using thin layers to build up the color gradually. This helps maintain the texture and details we worked so hard to smooth out in the previous steps. As I go, I focus on keeping the paint consistent and avoiding pooling or brush marks. Using thin, controlled strokes allows the green to layer nicely, giving the frog a smooth, even finish. The base layer doesn't need to be perfect yet. It's more about creating a solid foundation for the next steps, where we'll add highlights and shadows. Occasionally, I step back and look at the model from different angles to make sure the shading and highlights are balanced. Adjusting the green tones as needed ensures that the frog has a cohesive and visually appealing look from every side. Throughout the process, I'm keeping in mind the overall theme and personality of the Witchling Frog. The green base not only represents the character's natural color, but also sets the stage for the magical and whimsical touches that will come in later steps. By the end of this brushing session, the frog's body is fully covered in a rich green, with subtle variations in tone that give it life and dimension. It's amazing to see how much character a few layers of paint can add, transforming a simple 3D print into something that feels vibrant and alive. I also take a moment to refine small areas like the fingers, toes, and the edges around the hat, making sure the paint doesn't spill over onto other sections. This part requires patience and a steady hand, but it's also incredibly rewarding to see the character start to take shape.